And we're live. Welcome back to another episode. Feeling a little under the weather today, so I'm going to power through this one, but I think I got a good one for you guys. Uh, Today, I'm going to break down what I think is a really impactful framework in the modern leadership science, and it's titled "The Nine Critical Cognitive Leadership Skills." It's based on the work of a group of researchers by the names of Mumford, um, Aaron Michelle Todd, Corey Higgs, and Tristan McIntosh. And this, you can see the study here. Lots of highlights. They tend to focus on traits and personality and behavior, things like that. But this study challenges its readers to ask a deeper question, and that is, what does a leader actually have to think in order to be effective in their role? And so, this study, the authors provide theoretical and empirical argument that there are a certain set of cognitive skills as opposed to a set of innate qualities or behavior like charisma or confidence that provide the real scaffolding for leadership performance. And that's not necessarily to say that charisma and confidence aren't important, because they are, but that's not what the researchers discuss in the study, and it's not the argument that they're making. And they suggest that they're not necessarily the most important either. And they propose this argument, not necessarily just on speculation, but they use quite a number of prior studies uh, from their 2017 article. And these sample sizes that they use to create this argument range anywhere from 100 to 400 participants. They were drawn from military and officer populations, ROTC cadets, junior and mid-level military officers, and then even leadership development participants. And so, to do in doing so, they synthesized and formalized a really, really big body of empirical work that had been conducted across 15 years. And this all led to the author's articulation and formalization of this study, which again is titled "The Nine Critical Cognitive Skills Framework." But before we get into it, let's discuss who these authors are, just to give you some context. So Dr. Michael D. Mumford comes from the industrial organizational psychology field. He is the George Lynn Cross Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Oklahoma in the Department of Psychology, where he also directs the Center for Applied Social Research. And his expertise is in leadership development, creative problem solving, cognitive processes and decision making, and scientific and military leadership models. He's made a lot of notable contributions to the field. He's a really prolific scholar in applied psychology. I see his research all the time in the leadership field. He was central to the development of the skills-based approach, or the skills-based model of leadership, which emphasizes that effective leadership is learned through cognitive and experiential mechanisms as opposed to something that is innate in the person. And his work tends to integrate case-based reasoning, wisdom, and social cognitive theory into his leadership assessments, which is similar to this article that I'm going to go over. And he's also published well over 200 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters on leadership, organizational innovation, and even ethics. And so, in short, Mumford is a pivotal intellectual architect of the cognitive skills-based approach to leadership. And his work in this one and many others forms the foundation for a lot of leadership training programs in both the military and organizational settings. The second author in this study is Dr. Erin Michelle Todd, and she's currently an assistant professor at Louisiana State University in leadership and human resource development. And her expertise is in creativity and innovation and ethics and leadership in professional environments. Her research tend to focuses on training, development strategies for leadership roles, decision-making frameworks, and professional ethics training. And she's collaborated on projects with the U.S. Army and Department of Homeland Security based on her expertise. Uh, the the third author is a Dr. Corey Higgs, who is a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Oklahoma, and he's currently a assistant professor at Salem State University. His expertise is in the field of leadership, ethics, and creativity, and he's co-authored several works on leadership cognition, ethical decision making, and he has contributed to the understanding how leaders evaluate and implement creative ideas within organizational settings, according to some of the research I did on him. The fourth author and last author in this study is a Dr. Tristan J. McIntosh, who is currently an assistant professor of medicine in the Bioethics Research Center at Washington University School of Medicine. And her expertise is in areas of interest are in ethics, particularly issues in research, effective lab leadership and management, and the development and assessment of ethics education programs. She's a contributor to the research on ethical and social issues in science and medicine, and focuses on responsible conduct of research, neuroethics, and preventing misconduct in the medical malpractice. And so together, these four scholars form what I thought was a really impressively data-driven, theoretically grounded research team in the leadership science, especially for real-world applications like military and law enforcement and like high-stakes environments. And their collective work, specifically in this article that I'm about to discuss, emphasizes that leadership is a learnable skill, although cognitively demanding, but best evaluated through performance as opposed to personality or intelligence or other innate qualities. So now that we know a little bit about the authors, let's get into the article. The foundation of this study is built around the idea that leadership is not just a set of behaviors or traits. It's a cognitive process that revolves around skills like problem solving and decision making and adapting under pressure. And so Mumford and his colleagues draw heavily from cognitive psychology. And they argue that leaders operate in ill-defined dynamic environments, and unlike puzzles who have clear answers, leadership problems often have to use incomplete data, shifting constraints, high stakes environments, and solving those problems requires a unique kind of thinking as opposed to just a raw IQ and ability to deal with complexity. And instead, they require a structured cognitive skill. And so they base their skills model on three main theoretical pillars, one of which is the skills-based leadership theory, which is one of the contemporary leadership theories, which posits that leaders can be developed by improving their cognitive, interpersonal, and strategic skills. The second model, or the second pillar, is a case-based reasoning, which essentially contends that leaders can build what are effectively mental libraries of prior experiences, or in other words, a case that they can refer them to. And then as they build cases, they then structure this library and use that structure and that availability of cases to recall and make decisions in new but still somehow similar situations. And beyond that, the better a leader's ability to recall and structure, they argue that the better decisions that they will make. And the last pillar, the third pillar, is the social cognitive theory, which suggests that effective leadership depends on a leader's ability to monitor and regulate their cognitive processes, which I also find sound. And so the implication of these three pillars, at least according to the authors, is that leadership success isn't just about personality and intelligence or reacting. It's also, and perhaps even more so, about perceiving and framing and anticipating and learning, all of which are skills that are impacted by things like intelligence, but are things that can be enhanced through uh, skill development and training interventions. So let's walk through how these authors argue that real leadership thinking actually works, not just in theory, but also in practice. So they contend that it's really easy, but not sufficient to say that leaders need experience, which is true, but it's also incomplete, which I would agree with. What matters, according to the authors, is what that experience then turns into. And so the first theoretical analysis that the authors discuss is the analysis of expertise. And they construct the rest of their argument with this as their foundation. And the argument at this first level analysis is that leadership all starts with expertise. And so the author's position is that experts aren't necessarily just people who have been in the game longer. It requires more than that. There are people who have also organized that experience into usable knowledge. And over time, through repeated exposure and ideally reflection, experts and ideally leaders learn to discern what matters, make judgments on what causes success, predict what creates failure, what to pay attention to, and even what to ignore. And so the thing that's important to remember is that experience alone doesn't guarantee this. The central theme with the acquisition of experience is that, at least according to the authors, is that it has to be processed. And so leaders who don't reflect on their experience, all they're doing is just accumulating time, but they're not necessarily accumulating insight. And so the authors argue that those who build conceptually structured knowledge, which is what allows them to navigate complexity better than others. And so this experience, gathered over time and reflected on, is the raw material that's needed for each level of leadership development and its analysis after that. And so the authors argue that the raw material needed for leadership judgment is then what they call case-based knowledge, which is the second level of analysis from their theoretical background. And so the accumulation of experience and the follow-on reflection is what helps create this structured knowledge library needed for quick and accurate recall of their case-based knowledge. And this is your internal library of leadership events and experiences that you've seen and lived and also studied. Ideally, it's something that you studied. So we can think of each case in that library as a mini mental file. And then aspects of each case are going to include data points such as who is involved, what happened, what constrained the outcome, what worked, what didn't, things like that. And what makes this idea so powerful for leadership is how important it is for information to be accessible in real time. So when a leader encounters a problem, their brain starts scanning for similar past cases, or at least cases that are similar enough. And so the more recallable which is relying upon how well these cases are organized, and the more varied the leadership library and quickly recalled, the more likely a leader is to help find a helpful pattern, which is something that they can use to draw on when there's no playbook in front of you to help diagnose what's going on. And so this is where things get pretty interesting, and at least in terms of the theoretical background discussion, because the way the authors describe it, the mind doesn't just recall cases. It begins to create abstractions of them. And you need to be able to abstract those cases as you accumulate more, because it's harder and harder to remember each specific case. So you start to lump them together in similar categories, which is essentially a heuristic strategy that makes you better able to make leadership decisions more quickly. It's a mental shortcut, which takes us to the next level of analysis in their theoretical discussion, which are mental models. And then, so mental models is how we move from past cases that create leadership libraries, uh, which are then utilized to create present insights. And so when leaders reflect on multiple cases and take time to extract a common theme, they start building those mental models. And the authors define these mental models, or they basically use mental models and abstract frameworks synonymously. And so they define abstract frameworks as something that helps them explain how things work quicker. So what causes what outcomes to expect, and then what matters most in a given context. Another way to think about it, I think, is that a single case can tell you what happened, but a mental model helps you predict what will happen, even in a new, less familiar situation. And so it's the bridge between a raw experience and the strategic insight needed to make a decision. And so here's the takeaway at this point in the discussion. The better your mental model as a leader, or the better your set of mental models as a leader, the better your leadership decisions are going to be. And so the authors contend that uh, research on this is pretty clear, meaning the leaders who can create more simple, more coherent, and more accurate mental models are going to be the ones who outperform those who can't. So this takes us to our next theoretical pillar for this study, and that is the argument that even a strong mental model is useless, or perhaps less useful, unless a leader can actively use it, which connects us to the final piece. And that gets us into, or that will eventually get us into, the individual cognitive skills that I'm going to discuss. And so the authors describe cognitive skills as the leader's operating system. And so once a leader has gained knowledge from expertise and reflection, and has created the mental models derived from study and reflection on those experiences, they still need the software or skills to apply them. And this is where the 9 cognitive skills come into play. These are the mental tools that leaders use to diagnose problems, design plans, adapt strategies, communicate, sense making, things like that. And what's interesting is that as I was reading this, and as the authors were making their argument, each skill seems to build on what came before it. And the authors suggest that these 9 skills, they don't live in isolation, although they admit that the evidence is somewhat lacking on this particular topic. Uh, but the authors still seem to think that they're interdependent. And I would also suspect that to be the case. So my own personal experience seems to indicate that this is probably the case. Each one seems to support the others, and if you consider that planning requires some insight, and creativity depends on your ability to forecast, wisdom can help shape evaluation, idea evaluation, and sense making and vision making uh, is limited by the effectiveness of all the prior steps. So, to review the framework for this study in some more simple terms, expertise becomes case based knowledge. Case based knowledge accumulated enough, eventually, the brain has to start creating abstractions, or in other words, mental models. And the more accurate and the better your abstractions, uh, the more quickly and the more accurately case-based knowledge can be recalled and leveraged. And then your ability to then use that case-based knowledge and use those distractions and use those heuristics are what the authors refer to as cognitive skills. And I think a good way to think about this is based on the suspected interdependence of all these cognitive skills, is that if any link in the chain is weak, leadership performance will presumably drop. And then conversely, when it's strong, if you can get a leader who can think strategically, who can act decisively, who can adapt intelligently in high pressure environments, those are the leaders that are going to perform better. Which, having said that, it doesn't seem all that far fetched. At least I hope it doesn't. So let's go a little deeper, and maybe you guys can decide for yourself. In terms of the methodology, this article is essentially a synthesis of a larger body of empirical work that the researchers collected from 15 years of empirical data. And they reference studies that were used to written scenario task, performance evaluations. They had officer participants from the military. They had ROTC cadets. They had junior military officers. They had mid-level military officers. And they even reference studies from leadership development participants in some civilian structured programs. And these studies all basically relied on participants who were presented with some sort of complex leadership scenario, and the kind that doesn't necessarily have an obvious answer. And then each participant across all these studies created or wrote out or detailed some sort of response about how they diagnose and solve different problems. And sometimes they were given some sort of training intervention, sometimes they weren't, just to see how the interventions actually impacted their performance. And the responses that all these participants gave were then evaluated by some body of raters across a bunch of different dimensions by trained coders. And each dimension was essentially assessed as to whether or not it represented one or several of the 9 cognitive skills that Mumford and colleagues generated this study off of. And so based on all this research, it's Mumford's opinion that the inter-rater reliability were all statistically high in each study, and that the factor analysis of each study and then of each individual study, and then the collective factor analysis across all the studies confirms the validity of their skills-based approach, what they wrote this model on. And so the key innovation here that Mumford offers, or Mumford contends that he is offering to the leadership literature, is that it's a synthesis of real cognitive performance evaluations across a bunch of different studies, as opposed to a review of theoretical knowledge or leadership attitudes. So now that we've discussed the theoretical and empirical and the methodological background of this article, let's actually get into the skills that Mumford derived from their research. First one is what the authors refer to as problem definition. And so this is a leader's ability to accurately frame the central issue or the central problem in front of them. And so leaders who excel in this are going to be more likely to prevent any sort of premature action or premature decision, and ensure that they are actually attacking the right problem. An example of this would be clarifying whether some problem is a logistical issue, a cultural issue, or perhaps an interpersonal issue between two people, or a group of people. And the important thing here is that you are trying to identify root causes as opposed to symptoms. And so this is a It's not necessarily the most important skill, in my opinion, and it's certainly not the most important skill according to these authors, but it is a foundational skill. And so, uh, within that, I think is another skill that's worth mentioning. That's nested in this problem definition skill, and that is gathering information. So, in order to define a problem, a leader or a person needs information, which is done by scanning internal and external environments of the organization or circumstances. And so, again, I would argue that this in itself is a skill. And when I was still working in the military, I would take as much time as I could to afford to dedicate to information gathering, especially if I was short on any sort of expertise or wisdom or experience in any given domain. And so, uh, again, this skill is really important because if a leader frames the wrong problem, all your follow-on actions or decisions are going to be misdirected. Second skill is the cause goal analysis. And this skill is critical for long term strategic alignment when it comes to decision making. And so it helps a leader diagnose problems accurately and define clear outcomes. And so I think one of the keys here is understanding and recognizing the difference between correlation and causation. And while both are important considerations, conflating the two can be perilous for leadership performance because you inaccurately align root causes with your intended outcomes. And so, an example of this would be linking low morale or to unclear directives or poor incentives, as opposed to something more simple and easily dismissible, such as bad attitudes. And so, according to the authors, this particular skill is strongly correlated with clarity and direction of solutions when solving a problem. The third leadership skill in this article is constraint analysis. So, constraint analysis is the skill that grounds your vision in reality. It helps leaders avoid overreach by identifying limitations in different dimensions like time or budget, policy, regulations, morale, people, resources, capability, capacity, things like that. And so, an example of this would be noticing a plan assumes the uh, acquisition or possession of resources that the team doesn't have or won't have. And so this skill, strengthens the realism in a leader's planning efforts. Which brings me to the fourth skill, which is planning. And this is the skill that translates your diagnosis and cause goal analysis and constraint analysis into action. And so it involves organizing a set of sequential and flexible steps that move you towards your goal. An example would be including some sort of fallback or contingency option as opposed to a single path forward. And the authors note that this skill, across all these studies that they used to create their framework, was measured by some sort of temporally based logic train and feasibility considerations. So how well the logic played out over time and how well the logic matched with reality. And so, according to the authors, uh, its effectiveness is going to increase when it's paired with strong forecasting and constraint awareness. So, next we'll cover forecasting, which is the fifth skill in this list. And so, forecasting is what helps a leader anticipate the second and third order effects which is really important for proactive and resilient leadership performance. An example of this skill would be predicting that solving a budget issue may reduce team cohesion. So even though it's fiscally responsible, it might cause problems within the team. And then another one, which I've seen a lot, is that brute forcing your way through a problem that requires the buy-in of other people could lead to people not wanting to work with you in the future. And there's essentially two cognitive traits that are that build this skill. One is systems thinking, which is essentially the understanding and interconnectedness of components within a given system. And second is game theory, which is a framework for understanding how individuals and groups make decisions when their outcomes depend on the choices of others. And so these two frameworks are critical to this skill because an organization is essentially a living, breathing system filled with a bunch of people who all interact in some manner when they're pursuing their agendas. So the sixth and next skill on Mumford's list is creative thinking. And so we can define creative ideas as something that are both new and useful. Although I haven't discussed it in depth yet, the leadership literature and creativity literature make it really clear that it's critical for modern leaders to be able to generate, or perhaps more often, facilitate the generation of multiple novel approaches via their teams. And the reason I say facilitate the generation of multiple novel approaches is because it's really, really hard to be creative on your own. It's a little bit easier when you have more people because you can generate more ideas, but real creativity is rare. So the chance that, or the likelihood that you have it, is probably really low. So getting more people involved is going to create the higher likelihood of generating a creative idea. Yeah, what's your question? What you got? About 6 months. Anyways, so an example of creative thinking would be the ability to combine two outdated or perhaps loose fitting solutions into a new one that's more relevant and that is more tightly fitting for the situation at hand. And this is what I would consider my type of creativity, the way my brain tends to work. I'm only moderately creative at best, and so I need existing frameworks. I need to understand existing frameworks before I'm able to be creative. That's just the way my brain works. And the authors make a note that this skill is more effective when it's paired with uh, a accurate constraint analysis, which I think is an interesting connection to some of the creativity literature when it comes to leadership. And that is, uh, there's a bunch of paradoxes with leadership, but there's also specific paradoxes for creativity in leadership, or leadership that facilitates creativity. And one of those is that creative people can't or don't like to have a bunch of boxes around their ideas. They need to be able to mix everything. But if not there's not enough structure and constraints imposed on them, they'll also go off into all sorts of unhelpful directions just because that's how their creative brain works. They want to connect everything and mix everything, but in their attempt to do that, or in the process of doing that, they may not necessarily be achieving what they've been tasked to achieve. So constraints, both from a leadership skill perspective and leading creative people perspective, are important. The next and seventh idea skill for leadership, according to Mumford, is idea evaluation. And so this is the skill that helps filter and prioritize your ideas. It's also going to help prevent hasty or any unbalanced decisions. And so the authors suggest that this skill is really useful, which is obviously why they included it. But they also suggest, which I thought was the more interesting part of this, was that it's best applied after these higher order cognitive work or cognitive skills have been employed. And so an example of this would be the ability to rank three choices of alternatives and then identifying the trade-offs for each, and then eventually choosing the right one. And so the benefit of this skill, again, is that it prevents any sort of hasty or unbalanced or ill-timed decisions. The next skill, the authors characterize as wisdom. And I think they provide a really useful definition here, which is the ability to integrate experience, judgment, and ethical reasoning all at the same time. And this is a skill that helps leaders prioritize long-term trust from their people and sustainability. And so the hallmark of this is the ability to balance the tension between shorter term tactical gain and the longer term strategic integrity of the team or the organization. The last skill the authors characterize as sense making, vision making, or metacognition. And they define this as the ability to self reflect on how you think, question your own frame, and then adjust. Interestingly, it was also the strongest individual predictor in this 2017 study. And enables leaders to monitor and question and improve their thinking in real time. And so an example of this would be realizing mid-decision that you're reacting emotionally as opposed to strategically. I thought, as I was reviewing the study, I thought this insight was particularly interesting because I saw something from Echelon Front. I think it was Leif Babin, who's that organization, him and Jocko are two contemporary leadership development specialists, super successful. And this video that I saw had Leif describing a leader's most important job as reminding his team or their team what winning looks like. And I think you can characterize that as vision making and sense making. It's reminding your team why you're there and why they're putting in all this work. So I thought that was an interesting coincidence that I stumbled upon that as I was reviewing this study. So those are the 9 skills. Again, they are problem definition, cause goal analysis, constraint analysis, planning, forecasting, creative thinking, idea evaluation, wisdom, and sense making. And so the key takeaways from this, there's about 4 that I would offer. First is that sense making and cause goal analysis, as far as the author's research was concerned, provided the strongest individual predictors of leadership success. So if you're a leader and you're looking uh, on ways to improve your leadership performance, then perhaps start there. Start with your ability to sense make, and to create visions and those sort of metacognitive skills, and then your ability to create a cause goal analysis. The second key takeaway is that skills and their combinations seem to matter more than individual talents. So, an example of that is creative thinking, which is essentially openness to experience, trait openness to experience, which personality traits are stable over time. They tend to be genetically inherited, and it's really, really hard to change them to the upside. You can make someone like less creative and more dumb, but it's really, really hard to increase their ceiling for things like experience, openness to experience, and intelligence, your ability to deal with complexity. And then it actually gets like things like IQ actually tend to drop over time too. So it's people tend to have higher scores when they're younger. And so going back to this key takeaway, creative thinking was most effective when it was paired with a effective constraint analysis. And so the idea here is that uh, innate qualities like creative thinking or intelligence uh, are enhanced with additional skill development, which also means that someone that is lacking in creative thinking can enhance their ability to create new and useful ideas within the confines of their job or their leadership scenario when they have a better ability to create a good constraint analysis. The third and next insight that I think is worth talking about is that the leaders who scored higher or high in at least four of these skills have a significantly higher overall effectiveness in their ratings. So there's there's an argument to be made that you should be well rounded as a leader, which I agree with. But there's also an argument to be made to lean into and develop and learn to leverage your strengths. So find the ones that you're really good at and leverage those. And if you're not really good at four, well, find the ones that you can get better at fast and develop those. So, how do you apply all this? Well, for one, you can use the theoretical background and these nine skills as a diagnostic framework for yourself. You can ask yourself questions like, which ones do I lean on? Which ones can I triage while I'm developing myself? And which skills can I triage under pressure? Which ones can I train? Uh, or perhaps which ones do I need to train? And to do this, I would suggest starting small and then going bigger from there. You can journal, which a lot of leaders do, and a lot of leaders swear by. I personally don't do a ton of journaling in the contemporary sense, but I do in the sense that while I'm studying leadership literature, I'm always taking notes and documenting my own internal dialogue as I go through things. You can read you know, your organization's version of after action reports. And then, better yet, you can run your own after action reports in order to build your forecasting and your constraint analysis skills. I did both of these during my time in the military. Some of my positions early on in my career shortchanged me in the development of certain skills that I needed in others at later times, which I don't think is uncommon for any organization. But in any case, to make up for that, I read everything I could get my hands on, And I made sure to take my own after action reviews seriously, even if they weren't already mandatory. You can figure out how to facilitate scenario planning exercises to test your creative thinking relative to the domain that you're in, and reality check your wisdom, which is another thing that I relied heavily on when I was in the military. And so, again, some of my positions in the military, while they developed a lot of skills, they shortchanged my development in other certain skills that were critical later on in my career. And so I had to ask for help from my leaders and my mentors to help me work through fabricated scenarios and walkthroughs. And this did two things. One, it endeared me to my superiors because it showed that I took my development seriously and that I didn't want to let the people in my charge down. And two, it accelerated my development because it was a way that I could accelerate the acquisition of experience and the building of more clear mental models for later problem solving. Uh, on the topic of experience acquisition, I also have a few thoughts. First, you're going to be somewhat limited by the scope of your responsibilities in your current position. However, you can't let this be a straitjacket. And if you do, you're going to limit the experience that you can accumulate and wisdom that you can accumulate in a given period. So self-study is something that's really important to help combat the limitations that you have on your time within a given position. And as I already said, uh, it's important because you can learn leadership lessons from literally thousands of years of human experience. And I've long thought that if you aren't reading as a leader, you're essentially failing because you cannot accumulate experience fast enough just based on the day in and day out of your job responsibilities to the degree that is going to really accelerate your performance and perhaps more importantly to the degree that your people are going to need or expect from you. And I think this is especially true with first responders and law enforcement and military types where you're going to risk life, limb, or eyesight. Another way to accumulate experience faster is to increase the density of experiences per unit of time. And what I mean by that is seek out ways to accumulate experience within the confines of your position. And so, one thing that I did was I asked to attend as many leadership meetings and discussions as my leadership and my other obligations would allow. And that took the form of doing simple things like asking my supervisor if I could sit in on some of their meetings so I could learn more. And I would even offer to be a note taker so that at least I'm providing some more value to them in the process. And so they wouldn't have to do it. Another really useful thing that I did that I recommend people consider was a sober assessment and which involved other people, giving me an assessment of what they thought of me as a leader, and an assessment of myself of where I stood with each skill. And so from there, I would develop my shortcomings as much as I was able to, as much as was practical, which I still do. But more importantly, I did two other things that I think really facilitated more success. One, I leaned into my strengths. So I figured out what I was good at and I leveraged those as much as I could. And then I also sought to identify and leverage the strengths of others on my team in terms of their skills, especially when they weren't or they were skilled in areas that I wasn't. So the gaps that I had in my game, I learned to seek out and develop those skills in other people on my team so they can make up for my shortcomings. So that is Mumford's framework on leadership skills, which, to close out, again, is effectively showing us that leadership, while impacted by innate qualities like personality, intelligence, and conscientiousness, and charisma, and things like that, it is not limited by those things. It is a process, and it's built by skill development and deliberate practice. Okay, take a look at the chat and get some questions here. Here's a good one. I think there's something to both. It depends on what you define as quality experience. Something, making a mistake is a quality experience if you reflect and learn from it. But there's also, it's kind of like, think of it this way. It's kind of like periodization in the gym. So in the gym, you manipulate volume, intensity, and frequency. Frequency is how many sessions per unit of time. Volume is reps times sets, and then intensity is measurement of 1 rep max. So you could think of quality of experience as intensity, and you could think of volume as the same. Well, all three are variables that are important in different ways. So I don't think you should necessarily focus on one or the other. Get as many experiences as you can. So move fast in terms of acquiring more experiences, and the ones that are quality, hold on to and learn from, and the ones that aren't, dismiss. I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it. Wow, we got 6 people in the chat. Feeling famous. Hey, reach out to me on Instagram. We'll talk. All right. If that's going to do it. So, if this resonated with any of you guys, anybody in the replay gang, please hit the like, subscribe. If you're interested in working with me on a more personal basis, I'm happy to do that. You can reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. My link is in my bio, and you can also leave a comment on the video if you'd like to. All right. Out here.